Hello, my name's Ian Stewart and I'm delighted you've chosen to join me for this third part of a four-part series on Introduction to Problems of Evolution. So in this talk we're going to look at the main arguments which Darwinists use in favour of their theory. Well, perhaps just helpful just to outline at the start there that you have essentially two fundamental processes in Darwinism. You have change within a lineage, and then you have the formation of new lineages. Okay, so you have, for example, change within a lineage would be the five-toed horse becomes a one-toed horse. Okay, loss of toes, change within a lineage. Formation of new lineages is this belief that ultimately all the organisms you see there, the sharks, the primates, the rabbits, and the rodents, ultimately we all came from a single cell, and at a certain point there was a branch off, and the formation of a new lineage which gave rise to particular classes. Okay, so those are the two fundamental processes. Now, you recall when we studied in our second talk the role of mutations, say experiments on single-celled bacteria. We noted that the role of mutation in the struggle for life is often you get a loss of function. Okay, you get many generations of bacteria, it starts to conserve energy, throwing away chunks of its genetic patrimony. And it's interesting that one of the major arguments that Darwinists use in favour of the theory is this vestigial argument, something used to have a function but no longer does. Okay, and that's actually consistent with the observations we have of mutation. But Darwinists, they ultimately believe that a single-celled organism could structurally build new complexity, so it's not loss of function. They actually have to account for the origin of new function, as it were. But they do use this as a major argument, so we'll look at it now. Firstly, there's a correct use. The correct use is, say you look at the if you look at the hind limb there of the grey whale, you can see no longer has a limb, but it does have a vestige of a hind limb. Now, I would suggest to you that's because either the grey whale in the past had a rear limb, hind limb, or it was descended from a very similar organism to a grey whale, which had a rear limb. And perhaps through lines of sexual descent, changes in environment, mutations, combination of all, eventually lost function for that rear limb, for that hind limb, or for the same reasons that Darwinists believe in terms of the way they would explain that loss of particular function. You could also explain that very adequately, even in a extreme Bible pasture type context. If we look at the flightless birds, it may well be that the kiwi had a larger wing in the past, or was descended from one that had a larger wing. Same with the ostrich, perhaps. An organism used to have a large wing, and then because it became geographically isolated or whatever, it just lost its wing, lost its ability to fly over long periods of time. You can explain these vestigial arguments through descent without saying, therefore all biological life arose from a single cell. Okay, therefore all biological life is ultimately related. You can explain these examples quite comfortably. Now we're going to look at some incorrect examples, okay, of the vestigial argument. First incorrect example is the appendix. Now, the appendix is a tube connected to the cecum near the junction between the small and the large intestine. And it used to be said, well, it gets infected, it has no function, no intelligent agent would build an organism with the appendix. Okay, we now know it has endocrine cells. Say in fetal development, we observe that the appendix has endocrine cells. Okay, cells which control the development of the organism. Okay, so it has a role in the fetal development, switching on and switching on of genes and production of molecules and so on. So it has that role. It also is a lymphatic organ, so experimentally verified that it has a role in the immune system. But it does have a central role in fetal development, so the role it has in the immune system is sort of secondary to that, but it's not that it's irrelevant. So it does have a key function. Obviously Darwin didn't realise that at the time he was using it as one of his main arguments. Now, also, I think a lot of the time Darwinists aren't necessarily aware of, say what a creationist would necessarily believe about something like this. For example, a lot of mammals have, they contain molecules which help them digest cellulose, okay, in the appendix. So therefore they would say, man, because we're unable to digest cellulose, okay, because we don't have these molecules, therefore in the past we must have descended from an organism which needed to consume more vegetation and therefore would have had a function for the appendix, but now we're not consuming the same amount of vegetation, therefore we lose function. Well, even an extreme Bible basher, actually, what do they believe? Well, they actually believe that man was originally vegetarian, therefore could have had that function for the appendix, but it does have a function, but even leaving all that aside, it's worth pointing out. Other examples of incorrect use, the tonsils now have a role in the immune system. The coccyx, the tailbone, you'd find it very difficult. If you had just had a straight spine at the back, you can see some points I've raised there. If you just had a straight spine at the back, you'd have difficulty sitting, Its internal support structure helps keep the anus closed. So there's all sorts of functions like that. Additional examples. If you look at the size of the human genome, if you were to write it out in paper, sort of size 1 font, magnifying glass type size, it's about 500 volumes, each volume 500 pages, so the human genome is absolutely vast, it's over 6 billion base pairs. Now when we look at the size of that, it used to be argued by Darwinists that the majority of it did not have function, only about 2 to 3% had function, and they would say, prediction of Darwinism is fulfilled, But at the time, those within the so-called intelligent design movement did specifically say that they predicted that a function would be found for these remaining genes. That's exactly what we found. It's now over 80% and rising after the ENCODE project. Over 80% and rising. And consider, 500 volumes, 500 pages, such tiny font as it were. Consider the amount of information. Over 80% and rising is vast, so we'll ultimately see, I venture to predict that the belief that, say, a ape's genome could convert into humans within 7 million year time frame will ultimately be shown to be impossible. But anyway, there we are. So junk DNA, was a bad argument. You've also probably heard this one about the yolk gene, that humans have a yolk gene. It's not 100% true, It's the photologen, Now, photologen is an egg yolk precursor, It's not actually egg yolk per se. Now, it's part of a family of lipid transport protein, It has properties of a sugar, a fat, and a protein. Also, the N-terminal domain has a role as a signal peptide, which helps transport molecules. So this photologen has function as a transport molecule. It's also a nutritious molecule, so it has that function as well. And yes, it can be used to develop into egg yolk, in combination with other molecules, but it doesn't just have that one function, it has many functions, so you can't rule out its usefulness for, say, a human being. The second thing I'd perhaps just mention there is that why is it, given the size of the human genome, given the fact we sequenced it, given the vastness of it, that these examples keep coming up, in terms of the same examples keep coming up? The broken vitamin C gene, the yolk gene, which is actually an egg yolk precursor, which is actually a transporter molecule. Why is that? Well, I'd suggest that that's the best examples that Darwinists can use. So when you study the human genome, if it has a lot of function, and you look through it, you might expect to see, say, vestigial genes for scales, because ultimately believe human beings came from reptiles. But when we look for them, we don't find them. Or you'd expect to see, say, a vestigial ape nipple gene, and or coding which, if activated, could produce a ape nipple. But when we look for it, we don't find it. So the best is this sort of ambiguous gene, given the size, 500 volume, 500 pages. It's just an ambiguous gene which has many different functions. One of which is an egg yolk precursor. And the fact that vitamin C gene is broken, well, perhaps human beings used to produce their own vitamin C, but then through mutation, line sexual descent and so on, we lost the ability to do that. So we're perfectly able to explain these observations without any significant difficulty. We've also seen the vestigial argument in relation to the laryngeal nerve. No intelligent agent would create the laryngeal nerve because it goes down the neck, under the aorta, and then loops up, goes up the neck again, and activates the larynx. It could just go directly, so it's not very efficient design. What we now know, as knowledge increases, actually activates all the way down the neck. Okay, it activates many locations, not just the larynx. So there is actually indeed a good reason for it. So those who criticised the design, possibly didn't know what they're talking about at the time. Another major argument is this idea of atavisms. Now, if you look at here, there's legitimate examples of atavisms, expression of features which were received from an ancestor. Okay, so why is it that this snake has this leg growing out of it? Well, the reason why you get a leg growing out of a snake is because snakes were descended from organisms which used to have legs. Okay, so snakes used to have legs, and I always say, wouldn't tell a young Earth creationist that. Okay, they might jump on you. But so that's a legitimate example. You look at the hind limbs of whales, the fins, rear fins on dolphins. All these have clear structures. Okay, you've probably heard of the chicken teeth. Well, it's just been demonstrated that the jaws of the chickens can give birth to tooth-like structures. So it is possible to do that. So those are all legitimate examples of atavisms. Illegitimate examples are the coccygeal projection. Okay, if you look at the human being and the development of the embryo there, you see that it has the curvature of the spine and the tip, as it were, which becomes the coccyx. Now, you can see here from the human tail, and I've given two good examples there of the coccygeal projection. You can see, is any Darwinist really arguing that what one is observing there is something which belonged to a pre-existing organism? So we looked in the previous slide at, say, that snake. You could see that it was an actual leg. Okay, but if you look at that, did any ape really walk around with that projection? Okay, sometimes it's not even connected to the coccyx. Now, I suggest to you that just something gone wrong in the development process there. Okay, given the fact you've got 7 billion human beings, given the fact you've got a clear curvature with a tip on the end, is it not possible that you get a projection, occasionally? Something goes wrong in the regulation process. You also see the human nipples that follow the milk line. People say, well, therefore we're very similar to other mammals. Well, please note these are human nipples. Okay, these are not ape nipples, these are human nipples. So there'll be certain chemical triggers along the milk line which ensure that nipples are built there, and they're not just built anywhere. But something's gone wrong in the development process there, which has resulted in these human nipples. But please note, these nipples are not ancestor nipples. This tail is not an ancestor tail. Look at these primates, look at their tails. If you had a human being with one of them, okay, it'd be a much stronger argument, just like you get the leg with the snake, as an example. It's also worth just saying, why not more arguments? Why not more vestigial arguments? After all, why don't we find, as it were, scale genes? Why don't we find people being born with ape nipples and so on? Well, the reason is because we're not descended from apes, we're not descended from reptiles. Okay, last argument, biogeography. Now, Jerry Coyne sets up a false distinction. Okay, he says that the Bible believes, Christians believe, that the earth is young. The Bible teaches the earth is young. Bishop Ussher, 4004 BC, creation of the earth, right? Okay, complex subject, but use of perfect tense. Okay, first two verses in relation to the verbs, okay, mean that the first two verses of Genesis are a preface to the creation week. Okay, you look at day 4, the sun and stars, the word for made there is used for appointment of priests to distinguish between right and wrong, to separate from right behavior, wrong behavior. Okay, to distinguish between what's holy and what's not. Okay, so basically it's a complex subject, but very easy to establish that the age of the universe and the earth is indeterminate. Okay, there's a vast disjunction between the first and second verses, etc., etc. So the Bible does not teach the earth is young or the universe is young. The Bible teaches the global flood. Absolutely wrong. The word for world, which is used elsewhere in the Bible, is never used in relation to the flood. All animals in the world came from an ark. Not true. Okay, so you have a period of time where you have many years, okay, where you had pre-existing organisms living out for long periods of time. At a certain stage, you've got the Earth, or the Eretz, the land predominant translation in Genesis 1-2, in a state of waste. Okay, so you have this whole history of other biological organisms who are in existence, prior to, as it were, Genesis creation week, and that's a mainstream viewpoint. Okay, not communicated. God created all species in situ. Okay, not believed by creationists. So the arguments which are used in the biogeography arguments against belief in God are, say, you've got oceanic islands. Why no native mammals, reptiles, or amphibians? The Darwinists would say it's because they couldn't get there. Creationists would say because they couldn't get there. Islands have similar organisms. True, both would agree. Similar but with distinct differences. You get similar but distinct differences, okay, like deer and the elk, okay, similar climates. They adapted towards similar ends, okay? Perhaps they were descended from a common stock. Both creationists and Darwinists could agree on that. You look at the molecular clock, okay? Now, the fact that your genetic code codes what your body is going to be like means that the bodies of similar looking organisms are going to have more similar genetic codes than other organisms, okay? But even if you had, say, two types of crop, and a farmer comes along and genetically engineers a better version which had both positive aspects of two pre-existing crops, okay, you might conclude on a purely material basis that that new crop arose through an entirely natural process, but actually it was an intelligent agent using sort of pre-existing information, so you can't even rule an intelligent agent out on that level. We should also note that I would predict that, well, it's already the case, that to change information from, say, an ape to a human in a 7 million year time frame, it is basically just not going to happen. So I'd just like to say at the end that we can say in a conclusion that the main arguments used in favour of evolution, vestigial argument, atavisms, biogeography, are the main arguments used in favour of evolution are either neutral or poor. So that's the end of the third of the fourth talk. Look forward to seeing you for the fourth talk shortly. Okay, thank you.